Yeah, except if all of the members within the separated powers is either working at the behest of the capital owning class or directly a part of the capital owning class, then there is no separation of power, because then all the rulers are either directly capitalists or working for the capitalists, working at the behest of capitalists, so it doesn't matter. Let's watch a one-dime video from 1 day ago about the separation of powers is bad, and here's why. Or 3 days ago. Holy fuck.
The last thing before we go tonight, protecting our democracy.
And our democratic institutions threatened like
we have to
before.
defend our democratic institutions against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
We cannot take our democratic institutions for granted.
What is at stake in all of this is nothing less than our democracy.
And we will protect our democracy.
The Supreme Court is considered a sacred component.
Just want to say I appreciate your work. Not gonna lie, I grew up during the 9/11 era with Islamophobia trained into my brain, but all of this has totally shifted my mindset. What we in Israel are doing are indefensible. Hell yeah, dude. Proud of you. Now let me tell you something, okay? A lot of the fucking losers that you see online, if you're in this community, you're probably frequenting a lot of spaces online, okay? A lot of those places online have been born into their own very specific version of Islamophobia. A lot of the dudes that are in like the debate space, for example, they all grew up in the 2013, 2014 Gamergate era where, especially under the Obama administration, the atheism, the r/atheism type commentators directly turned away from the George W. Bush defense of the Iraq war, like, because they were critical. A lot of people were critical of George W. Bush by the end of his, a lot of people in independent media or whatever was considered independent media at the time were very critical of George W. Bush. A lot of people, including Sam Harris, for example, would even go so far as to like yell at George W. Bush for like stem cell research and things of that nature. But under Barack Obama, every single person who was like supposedly a liberal centrist slowly started shifting against Muslims in a more aggressive tone, I would say, and started criticizing Barack Obama and became more and more right-wing. Yeah, the skeptic community flipped hard fucking right under the Obama administration. Some of the most common things that they would yell about is like the designation of Muslims from Pakistan being considered Asian. Like they thought, American skeptics thought that this classification was a way to shelter the Islamic crimes that were occurring in European countries. And not because people from Pakistan are Asian, technically. Like, they used to say shit like that. Yeah, why doesn't Obama say Islamic terror was a common point? That was a big point of contention. Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and the like. A lot of those guys ate good off that Islamophobia. You had different seasonings of such Islamophobic sentiment, of course, that popped the fuck off. For example, what was another one? Let me think. There was dude, my brain has fucking ceased to function. Technically not even Asian, we're literally South Asian. Yes, I know, but Bill Maher too, but what was I gonna say? I'm not remembering now. I forgot what I was gonna say. Fuck. Yeah, but there was a lot of panic about the Iran nuclear deal. Why won't you say Islamic terrorism? That was a big point of contention. And a lot of those guys like basically became the foundations of the Gamergate community. Slowly but surely pushing further and further to the right. Some of them have like snapped out of that under the Trump administration. But I do think that, Ayaan Hirsi Ali is what I was going to say. There's varying degrees of like Islamophobia. My favorite was always was it God Saad and Ayaan Hirsi Ali of like the former Muslim, the ex-Muslim anti-theists that are so fucking annoying. Ayaan now has moved away from being atheist to being Christian now because the grift must continue. So, Imam of Peace is another one. So yeah, those guys all popped off. They're super fucking racist. They're super Islamophobic. They're fucking insane. They said a lot of psychotic shit. Wasn't God Saad also ex-Muslim? I don't know. But regardless, it was a Majid Nawaz, not God Saad. Sorry. Your broadcast taught me that the Islamic world was way less fundamentalist prior to Western intervention, an idea that very quickly debunked Sam Harris and Bill Maher ideologies. Yes, I've talked about this quite a bit. One of the main things that I used to do when talking about, like Islam was like talking about the golden age, which would really break a lot of the edgy debate lords' brains early on when I first started on Twitch. Was it Majid Nawaz? I don't know. There's another guy. There's a bunch of like former Muslim guys. Majid Nawaz is the former extremist. Yeah. Yeah. Everyone used to, that would make them malfunction. I would always show Americans that like white evangelical Protestants were less tolerant than Muslim Americans were to like LGBT community members and stuff like that. And all of these fucking debate lords would lose their minds. They'd be like, no, that's not true. And then I would fucking show them the stats and they would still cope and seethe. Another classic from that very same communities of people that like had these preconceived notions despite the fact that they thought that they were progressive when they clearly weren't, was what else was I gonna say? Fake study? No. The thing was Nigerians having the highest population density of like higher education in the country as far as like ethnic groups goes. Like that's another thing that fucking breaks the minds of people who have like remnants of white supremacist ideology built into their very existence without them recognizing it. Like you can be a liberal, but when you say something like that, they go, "Whoa, what the fuck? That can't be true." But you know, all of that stuff's coming back. It seems it's because it's related to a Eurocentric conception of reason and civilization. Dawkins, Darwinism, and bullshit. It's no wonder they support colonialism today. Yeah, so that's where we're at. It's coming back. It's coming back in a big way.
Of the United States system of checks and balances, which is considered to be one of the most democratic features of American democracy. Though in recent times, the Supreme Court has come under fire for the Roe v. Wade decision that allowed states to outlaw abortion and contraception. The US Supreme Court has also recently rejected President Joe Biden's extremely moderate climate change policies to regulate emissions, and they also struck down his very modest plan to relieve student debt. Why does the Supreme Court, a supposed bastion of US democracy, frequently go against the will of the majority of Americans? Is it just because the Republicans under Donald Trump stacked the Supreme Court with ultra-conservative judges? Well, yes, but the problem runs much deeper. What if I told you that the US Supreme Court was designed to be a check against democracy from the very start? And not only that, the even bigger pill to swallow is that the United States system of checks and balances as a whole is structured to be undemocratic.
What? No. Our fucking slaver brigade of petty bourgeois and bourgeois tyrants that did a bourgeois revolution against the English monarchy certainly would not have tried to maintain their power structure. No. That's crazy. Can't believe that. What? This is a false video. Stop watching now. By the way, one dime is great.
Now, some of what I'm about to show you in this video is already fairly well known by many critical historians, but some of what—
Yeah, when I say like a bourgeois revolution, I mean like they weren't just like aristocrats and shopkeepers and shit. I'm talking they literally owned humans, okay? They were slave owners.
What you're going to hear in this video is fairly unknown to most people, especially Americans.
Yeah,
now, for starters, it's worth considering the class interests and openly anti-democratic sentiments of the American system's founding architects, which should at the very least make you a little bit skeptical of the system they designed. The framers of the US Constitution made no secret of the fact that the American political system was designed to divide and conquer the working majority. James Madison, key architect of the US Constitution, literally called it divide et impera. In the Federalist Papers, Madison was quite explicit that the US electoral system was deliberately structured to preserve the spirit and form of popular government, but to take away its substance so that a, quote, unjust and interested majority could not, quote, discover their own strength and act in unison with each other, and invade the rights and freedoms of the propertied classes. This method of dividing and conquering the population has been well documented by historians, but it is rarely emphasized just how much the decentralization of political power can actually serve an undemocratic function itself. When it comes to the undemocratic nature of the United States and other countries, most people solely focus on the concentration of unaccountable power in the hands of the central government, especially within the national security agencies. Okay, unless you're already in the know, prepare to have your brain explode. The separation of powers, widely seen as one of the most democratic features of US democracy, is actually one of the system's most undemocratic features. Decentralization is typically assumed to go hand in hand with democracy, and the separation of powers sounds like quite an appealing concept, even to those on the left, as it coincides with the common sense notion that power corrupts. According to most mainstream conceptions of the US government, the purpose of the separation of powers is to prevent a monarch, dictatorship, abuse of power, or the tyranny of one faction.
Yeah, except if all of the members within the separated powers is either A, working at the behest of the capital owning class, or B, directly a part of the capital owning class, then there is no separation of power in a class-based society. Because then all the rulers are either directly capitalists or working for the capitalists, working at the behest of capitalists, so it doesn't fucking matter. Oh yeah, the guy in the Supreme Court also working for the capital owning class. The guy in the legislative body also working for the capital owning class, or directly is a capital owner himself. So there is no real process there where there is like genuine workers that have any kind of control or say in the government.
But in reality, the main tyrant that the US founders of the Constitution were trying to protect against was none other than their own people, or as James Madison called them, the quote, tyranny of the majority. Contrary to the famous dictum of "we the people," the real function of the separation of powers is the separation of the people from power. Democracy is supposed to be about power to the people, but the separation of powers in practice actually takes power away from the people. Far from preventing the tyranny of any unaccountable state authoritarianism, we know that doesn't work, or the protection of minorities.
Also, like, this is shit.
Unless you're talking about the rich.
Okay, there's a George Floyd post there. Okay, let me say something. As far as no, I won't get banned for that. It's not excessive gore. Shut the fuck up. But that is something I don't show out of respect. But the thing I forget what I was gonna say. God damn it. American Republicans especially still channel this concept. Even liberals themselves, like Democrats themselves, channel this concept whenever they repeat the line "tyranny of the majority." The tyranny of the majority is just straight up democracy. Okay, and the inverse of the tyranny of the majority, which is what we're supposed to be avoiding, is the tyranny of the minority, which is what we currently have. It is like predating the concept of Marxist thought, while simultaneously creating, even before Marxist thought, the most anti-communist, anti-Marxist sentiment you could literally bake into the foundational principles of this country. Okay? Philosophically speaking, it quite literally is like anti-communist before even communism was a thing in the way that we understand it. Like, think about it. The entire point of socialism is changing society from a dictatorship of the bourgeois to a dictatorship of the proletariat. It's crazy.
The actual function of the U.S. separation of powers is to limit political democracy.
But Lincoln used the system to end slavery. First of all, the founding charter of the Republican Party literally was ending wage slavery in the North. It featured ending wage slavery in the North and the system of chattel slavery in the South, which was dropped very quickly. And secondly, Lincoln didn't necessarily use the system to end slavery. One may even say slavery never really ended. It just became legal, just like bribery is legal in this country in the form of corporate lobbying. Slavery is legal in this country under the carceral structure in the 13th Amendment. And secondly, the fact that you're saying Lincoln used the system to end slavery is so funny because, like, there was, I don't know if you know this, but like a whole war happened. So even then, the abolition of slavery only came after a fucking war, dog. What the hell?
To a propertied minority, while preventing economic democracy for the propertyless majority. Far from being a government built on the meaningful consent of the governed, the American system of checks and balances makes it practically impossible for the demands of most citizens to be implemented without the consent of at least a significant portion of a ruling class minority. The undemocratic functions and origins of each branch of government, and that includes the presidency, the Supreme Court, the Senate, and even Congress, are described in detail throughout the book titled We the Elites: How the U.S. Constitution Serves a Few, by Robert Ovitz. I highly recommend giving it a read. Within America's matrix of political judicial institutions, for the demands of regular citizens to be implemented, policy proposals must somehow pass through the House, the Senate, where most bills famously go to die, and avoid a presidential veto, and avoid being struck down as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Not to mention the fact that most members of Congress, senators, Supreme Court justices, and the executive branch are heavily influenced by their corporate donors and policy advisors, who often have corporate ties and/or have been groomed in elite institutions and fed ruling class ideology. If you want a really good book that proves this in great detail, I would highly recommend the sociologist G. William Domhoff's Who Rules America. And the dominant classes and wealthiest elites of society do not need to be united to have their way with the US government. The elite minority needs to only win once in this process to—
Oh my God, we found a Bitcoin guy. Bitcoin fixes this. Bitcoin is decentralized money. Opt in the Bitcoin standard. Opt out of the fiat debt slavery standard. Do your homework. Love dollar sympathizers. Keep enjoying the dollar debt slavery cycle. Dollar purchasing power is lost. I don't have time to convince you. I'm just trying to empower normal people again. Dude, I believe in you too, King. I love that there's like a guy still in here. I think like I've had a lot of purges in this community, oftentimes on issues that I'm like 100% objectively correct on. But of course, I'm objectively correct in the most annoying fucking way possible, in the most condescending way possible, that causes me to hemorrhage fucking followers because they're just like, nah, fuck you, dog. And Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, and NFTs is like one of those instances where so many people that were in this community were so fucking mad at me non-stop. Okay? And what ends up happening in that like sheer arrogant moment where I know I'm 100% correct is that they just never come back after they lose all their money. Sucks. One aspect of my commentary that I think a lot of people enjoy, but also, my naysayers get very upset at, and then never come back and become like weird parasocial haters.
To prevent change and maintain the status quo. As a result, even the most watered-down compromises not favored by the corporate rich have been prevented from being passed. And there are many examples of policies that have a lot of popular support being blocked by just a tiny section of the US government. A contemporary example is how the fossil fuel industry was able to subvert Joe Biden's climate change policies by lobbying and funding Senator Joe Manchin, who was able to single-handedly block Joe Biden's Build Back Better legislation. Far too many liberals, conservatives, and even leftists place blame on individual politicians and their partisan affiliations rather than the system itself, each of them claiming to uphold the Constitution and paying fidelity to America's democratic institutions. Now, one would think that a system that is so deeply undemocratic would undergo major reform. Yet the insurmountable threshold needed to change the US Constitution makes the prospect of radical systemic change nearly impossible. Any proposal to change the US Constitution must achieve 2/3 support in the Senate and House of Representatives, and must get 3/4 approval from the states. Despite over 11,000 attempts to amend the US Constitution over the past 2 centuries, the Constitution has only been amended during this time a mere 27 times. 27 times in about 230 years. That means that in the past 230 years, changing the US Constitution has had a success rate of a mere 0.00245%. The US Constitution is the oldest constitution still in effect, and has not seen a single major change in the past 3 decades. I mean, even Thomas Jefferson thought the Constitution should change every 40 years. US politicians—
Yeah, Jank used to talk about this all the time. He still does. This is the whole basis of Wolfpack, to end Citizens United, to overturn the Citizens United decision.
Zealously invoke the Constitution
to end corporate
like
lobbying.
Biblical scripture. The near impossibility of reforming the US Constitution is further ensured by the Supreme Court, which is arguably the most undemocratic obstacle to systemic change in the United States. The Supreme Court can single-handedly strike down or roll back legislation that it deems to be in conflict with the Constitution, no matter how popular it is or even if it managed to pass through the House and Senate. The Supreme Court is in many ways kind of like a judicial aristocracy. Supreme Court justices are appointed by the president rather than being elected by the people, and they are virtually unaccountable to the public. They also have life tenure, meaning that they get to serve until they're dead. And they can be removed from office only for misconduct through impeachment by the House and conviction by a 2/3 vote after a trial in the Senate. In the 2021 version of his classic book, Who Rules America, G. William Domhoff calls the US Supreme Court a bastion of corporate dominance, the ultimate protector of the interests of the corporate community. Seriously, I highly recommend picking up this book, or at least checking out his lectures on YouTube. They're really interesting and very accessible. Throughout most of its history, the Supreme Court's members have came mainly from backgrounds in corporate law and have more often than not made decisions favorable to corporate power and against the rights of labor unions. In fact, it has been well documented that Supreme Court justices have issued hundreds of decisions involving corporations in which they own stock. I'm not kidding. Supreme Court justices literally being in charge of cases involving companies which they literally have stock in. Talk about a conflict of interest. Despite all this, many hopeful left-leaning Americans still believe that, although deeply flawed, the US political system still allows the possibility for a democratic socialist to attain the presidency and implement their policies designed to serve the working majority while weakening the corporate rich. What they fail to accept is that the uniquely undemocratic institutional features of the American system make the success of a socialist party, and more importantly, the actualization of the interests of its constituency, almost impossible. That is, assuming they recognize the legitimacy of these institutions. And given how many liberals and leftists believe the fear-mongering that Donald Trump was going to undermine America's supposed democratic institutions, it is unlikely that they would be willing to go against these institutions to implement their agendas, even though they're literally designed to prevent them. American social democrats think that they can just do what countries like France, Denmark, and Sweden did, and vote in a democratic socialist party. But America is different, and it has a system that makes these things virtually impossible. Many have asked the question, why no socialism in America? And there are many reasons as to why America has historically lacked a socialist tradition compared to other countries in the world, and how many of its democratic socialist movements have been contained. But most people don't seem to recognize that the American system's uniquely undemocratic structures foreclose the very possibility of a democratic socialism, even if a socialist politics was more popular. At least that is within the current system's institutional arrangement. Not only that, but most American leftist social democrats fail to consider the limitations of past social democracy in European countries, and the fact that these countries had more radical communist movements on the horizon before social democratic parties were elected, as the presence and popularity of communist movements allowed the social democratic reformists to be positioned as a less radical compromise in contrast. And not to mention the tragic failures of the more radical attempts at electoral socialism in countries like Chile. For more on this subject on the topic of so-called democratic socialism, I highly recommend watching Second Thought's video on why social democracy is not enough. And that is not to say that socialism should not be democratic. It should absolutely be democratic, with a socialist conception of liberty that gives real economic democracy to the working majority. There'll be a video series on socialist alternatives in the future on this channel at some point, so definitely hit subscribe and the notification bell if you want to stay tuned. Now, the idea that the system is fundamentally rigged against you might seem like quite a depressing pill to swallow. Yet those who encourage you to be naively optimistic about working within a system deliberately designed to block the type of policies that you want only ends up serving the powers that be. These optimistic, moderate social democrats often consider their politics to be pragmatic and realistic. In reality, many of these practical reformists are themselves drinking from the fountain of ideology, which gets them drunk enough to avoid facing the sobering reality of the present situation. Those who tell you to just have hope in a fundamentally broken system are really just selling you cope. Just imagine if the leaders of the American Revolution had the same delusional mentality about the British Empire and their deranged system that upheld the divine right of kings. The creation of the American Republic in 1776, which inspired many democratic movements across the world, was only possible once enough people abandoned their faith in the institutions of the British monarchy and no longer recognized its legitimacy. In a time marked by increasing nihilism and a profitable industry of false hopes, perhaps a diligent first steps Americans can take to improve democracy is to find tenacity in faithlessness. If you enjoyed this video and get educational value out of my work, consider becoming a patron. Helps me put out videos more frequently, and it also gets you access to my Discord and a nice backlog of exclusive content. If you're still here, just remember, a strong centralized government capable of acting in accordance with the general will of its people.
The video is called "The Separation of Powers is Broken, Here's Why."
Of the popular majority is, in effect, more democratic than a government with checks and balances designed to curb policies that enhance economic democracy. I'll let you think about that for a little while.
Continue to organize and get out there on the ground is the only way. Let's keep going. These fucking plantation-ass buildings won't save us. There's work to do. Yeah, I mean, this is why I always stress the importance of building a robust labor movement. because it is one of the first places where you can like directly see the positive results of having more democracy or having something close to a democracy, a democratic process. And then you can create a coalition of labor unions that can then force the Democratic Party's hand. At least one of the two parties in our two-party system force their hand in doing the right thing. Democratic Party getting their hand forced, sure thing. I mean, I think my perspective is very realistic on this. Okay? I think I have a very realistic perspective on this. I believe that you have to open up opportunities for more democratization to occur. As it stands currently in the United States of America, capitalism being our national religion and the Constitution being treated like a fucking Bible for some goddamn reason, it is virtually impossible to like magically create a vanguard, okay? I don't ever believe that the United States of America will turn into a socialist utopia anyway. I think it, at the very best, in the lifetimes of generations far after mine, we'll only be able to create a process where America at least gets out of the way, and doesn't actively interfere. I do believe in the inevitability. I think that the welfare state can only create band-aid solutions to continue capitalism, for so long. It's not permanent. The inherent contradictions are far too great and routinely lead to systemic collapse over and over again. And I think that ultimately, unions are not left-wing. It's not a religion. Yeah, you are not a Marxist or an internationalist, I guess. I'm simply stating that the best America can do is get out of the way. I don't know if America has... you're assuming America will exist by the end of the century? Okay, that's fair. That might also not be the case either. Out of the way for who? There are plenty of countries with tremendous amounts of revolutionary potential that are infinitely closer in their material realities to their own version of socialism or their socialist revolutions. And they're currently being held back by the stabilization efforts of the Western world. And that is done deliberately, specifically with the interest of maintaining unequal exchange, extracting manual labor and natural resource from the global South. I think it requires a tremendous amount of empathy for the average American living in the imperial core to deny the realities of being a part of the labor aristocracy.